Let's toast to my country girl daughter-in-law, who was lucky enough to snag my son, my mother-in-law declared. My husband burst out laughing, but my mom stood up and calmly said something that made my mother-in-law sit down and fall silent. You know how some people just have this way of making you feel small without actually saying anything directly mean? That was my mother-in-law, Patricia, in a nutshell. Picture this. We're sitting around her massive mahogany dining table in her Westchester County mansion, the kind of place where even the salt shakers probably cost more than my first car back in Ohio. It was supposed to be a celebration dinner. Jake, my husband, had just made partner at his law firm, and Patricia insisted on hosting this big family gathering. The chandelier above us was sparkling like something out of a movie, and I'm pretty sure the china we were eating off could have paid for my college textbooks. But here's the thing, no matter how fancy the setting was, I always felt like I was wearing a neon sign that said, "Doesn't belong here." My mom, Linda, had driven up from our little farm town in Ohio for the occasion. First time she'd ever visited Patricia's house, actually. I watched her taking everything in with those sharp eyes of hers, the kind that missed nothing. She'd raised 4 kids basically on her own after Dad passed, so she knew people pretty well. Jake was in his element, laughing and telling stories about his big win in court. He looked so happy, so proud. And honestly, I was proud of him too. But Patricia? She kept shooting these little glances my way, the kind that made my stomach twist up in knots. The thing about Patricia's comments was that they always came wrapped up like compliments, you know? Like earlier that evening when I complimented her roast, she smiled sweetly and said, "Well, I suppose growing up on a farm, you'd appreciate good quality meat when you taste it." Jake just chuckled and kept eating, but I caught the edge in her voice. This had been going on for 3 years now. 3 years of, "Oh, Sarah, you're so lucky Jake doesn't mind that you're not from his usual social circle." 3 years of, "It's refreshing how uncomplicated your background is." Always delivered with that perfect smile and just enough sugar to make everyone else think she was being nice. Mom was picking up on it though. I could tell by the way she'd pause mid-bite sometimes, fork halfway to her mouth, when Patricia would drop one of her little bombs. Mom had this way of tilting her head slightly when she was really listening, really processing. She was doing a lot of head tilting tonight. Jake's always been so generous with his affections, Patricia continued, cutting her meat with surgical precision. Even in high school, he'd befriend the scholarship kids. She glanced at me when she said it, and my cheeks burned. I wasn't even a scholarship kid. I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for college, but correcting her would just give her more ammunition. Jake was oblivious, going on about some case involving corporate mergers. He had this habit of getting tunnel vision when he was excited about work. Meanwhile, Patricia was getting bolder with each course, like she was testing how far she could push before someone called her out. Mom just kept eating, kept watching, but I noticed she'd stopped making small talk. Then came dessert, some fancy French thing that probably had a name I couldn't pronounce, and Patricia stood up with her crystal wine glass. You know that feeling when you sense something bad is about to happen? Like when the air gets thick before a thunderstorm? That's exactly what this felt like. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, and everyone stopped talking. Even Jake put down his fork and looked up at his mother with this expectant smile. The dining room got so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Patricia raised her glass higher, and her voice took on this theatrical quality, like she was performing for an audience. "Let's toast to my country girl daughter-in-law who was lucky enough to snag my son." She paused for effect, her eyes sparkling with what I now know was pure malice. Some girls just know how to spot a good opportunity when they see one. The words hit me like a slap. My face went hot, and for a second I couldn't even breathe. She'd basically just called me a gold digger in front of the whole family. In the most polite, civilized way possible, of course. Jake burst out laughing, actually laughing, like his mother had just told the funniest joke in the world. "Mom, you're terrible," he said, still chuckling as he raised his own glass. He thought it was harmless teasing. He had no idea his mother had just gutted me with a smile. The other relatives around the table shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A few forced smiles, nobody quite sure how to react. But Mom? Mom just sat there, perfectly still, watching Patricia with those sharp eyes. Then, slow as molasses, she stood up. Mom stood up like she had all the time in the world. No rushing, no dramatics, just this calm, steady movement that somehow commanded everyone's attention. The room went dead silent, and Patricia's smug smile started to waver just a little around the edges. "Well now," Mom said in that soft Ohio drawl of hers, the one that got more pronounced when she was really thinking. "That's an interesting way to put it, Patricia." She picked up her water glass, not wine, never touched the stuff, and held it like she might actually toast back. "Speaking of lucky," Mom continued, her voice still honey, sweet but with something steel hard underneath. "I was just thinking how lucky we all are that people can reinvent themselves in this country. Take you, for instance." Patricia's face went a shade paler. "I'm sorry?" "Oh, I think you heard me just fine. Patricia Sue Grimes." Mom used Patricia's full maiden name like she was reading it off a birth certificate. Which, knowing my mother, she probably had been. "From the Riverside Trailer Park in Mobile, Alabama. Population 847, last I checked." You could have heard a pin drop. Jake's mouth literally fell open. Patricia looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Mom wasn't done. "Funny thing about small towns, we all know each other. My cousin Betty runs the post office down in Mobile, has for 30 years. She remembers the Grimes family real well. Especially little Patty Sue, who used to come in barefoot, picking up welfare checks for her mama." Patricia's wineglass started trembling in her hand. The perfect posture, the practiced accent, everything was cracking right before our eyes. "Now, don't get me wrong," Mom continued, still in that deadly calm voice. "There's nothing shameful about coming from nothing. Nothing shameful about government assistance or trailer parks or having a mama who drank too much." She paused, letting that sink in. "What's shameful is forgetting where you came from and looking down on others who remind you of it." The silence stretched out forever. Patricia just stood there, frozen, like her whole carefully constructed world was collapsing around her ears. Patricia's wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor, red liquid spreading across the expensive Persian rug like spilled blood. She didn't even look down at it, just stood there staring at my mother with this expression of pure horror, like she was seeing a ghost from her past she thought she'd buried forever. Jake was looking back and forth between his mother and mine, his brain clearly struggling to process what he'd just heard. "Mom?" he said, and his voice cracked like he was 12 years old again. Is that true?" Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. For the first time in the 3 years I'd known her, the woman who always had a cutting remark ready was completely speechless. Mom set her water glass down gently and looked around the table at all the shocked faces. "Family's family," she said simply. "Doesn't matter if you grew up in a mansion or a mobile home. What matters is how you treat people." Her eyes found Patricia again. "Especially people who love your children." That's when Patricia finally sat down, heavily, like all the air had gone out of her. She looked smaller somehow, older. The perfect mask she'd been wearing for decades had cracked wide open, and underneath was just a scared little girl from Alabama who'd spent her whole adult life running from herself. Jake reached over and took my hand under the table, squeezing it tight. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she was." He couldn't even finish the sentence. The other relatives started making awkward small talk, trying to pretend like nothing had happened, but the damage was done. Patricia's reign of terror was over, ended by a farm woman from Ohio who'd done her homework and wasn't afraid to use it. Mom sat back down and calmly picked up her dessert fork. This French pastry is lovely, Patricia, real fancy. The kindness in her voice somehow made it even more devastating. You know what's funny? After that night, Patricia never made another snide comment about my background, not one. It was like Mom had flipped some kind of switch in her head, and suddenly she remembered what it felt like to be on the receiving end of judgment. Jake apologized for weeks afterward, kept saying he should have stood up for me sooner, should have seen what his mother was doing. Truth is, I think he genuinely didn't realize how cruel she was being. Some people are just lucky enough to never be the target, so they don't recognize the signs. But once he understood, he made it crystal clear to Patricia that disrespecting me meant disrespecting him. The change was dramatic. Patricia started asking about my family back home, actually listening when I talked about farm life. She even sent my mom a thank you card after Christmas, though she never directly acknowledged what happened that night. Some people apologize with words, others with actions. The rest of Jake's family treated me differently too. Suddenly, I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the woman whose mother had put the family matriarch in her place with nothing but truth and grace. There's a certain respect that comes with that. Mom never mentioned it again, just went back to Ohio like nothing had happened. But every time I face someone trying to make me feel small now, I hear her voice in my head. Family's family, doesn't matter where you come from. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting angry, it's just telling the truth at exactly the right moment.